everybody. This is our sixth, I believe, OLLI presentation. Today we're featuring our principal percussionist, Keegan Sheehy. He has been with the symphony since 2016, and he also plays in several other local orchestras. So I'm going to hand it off to Keegan and let him talk a little bit about himself.
Sure, that sounds fun. So, as Sammy said, I'm Keegan Sheehy, and I play principal percussion in the Terre Haute Symphony. I also play in the Evansville Philharmonic, and I sub regularly in a bunch of other orchestras around Indiana and Kentucky as much as I can. Obviously a little bit less this year, but still a bit. Let's see, a little bit about how I got here. I grew up in Massachusetts, in a little suburb way outside Boston. I did my undergraduate degree in percussion performance at Ithaca College in Ithaca, New York, up in the Finger Lakes. And then I moved out here to the Midwest and did my master's degree and a performer diploma at Indiana University, where I also got an outside area in arts administration for one of those degrees. And with that arts administration and performance background, right now I've kind of got a two-sided career working in performing and also working in, I work a job in one of the administrative offices for the IU Jacobs School of Music. And so I do kind of both of those things and try to keep that balanced as best I can while playing as much as I can. Back in my undergrad days, I spent most of my time and energy on playing the marimba, which you'll see here, and we'll get to that later, and playing a lot of like contemporary and chamber music's interesting, creative kind of work. And then when I came to IU for my graduate degrees, I started broadening my horizons a lot. I put some time into different world musics, some different Afro-Cuban secular and sacred traditions, some Brazilian folkloric traditions, and I also started putting a lot of time into orchestral percussion and started taking auditions for different orchestras, and that's how I ended up playing with Terre Haute and working on the chops for these different orchestral instruments that we're going to be talking about today. And I think with that, may as well go straight into talking about some percussion instruments. So for those who are a little unclear on the terminology here, percussion essentially refers to any instrument that you strike or hit in some way to create its main sound. Sometimes the definition gets a little bit wibbly wobbly. Some of the things that we're hitting, we're not really hitting, we might be scraping, we might be bowing, we might be shaking around to make the sound that it makes. And often what percussion kind of turns into is, and I mean this with great love, the orchestra's dumping ground for anything that's not, you know, if it's not something already being covered by another section, the strings, the brass, the woodwinds, the piano, if it doesn't fit in any of those, it ends up on us. So maybe someday I'm playing, you know, a couple of normal drums, but also have to play a kazoo or a whistle or shake around a whirly tube or a bull roar. You never really know what you're gonna get. Tin cans, who's to say? And that's the challenge and the fun of percussion, is that for any gig, we never know what we're gonna be called to do until we get the music. And then you just put in the time to figure out how to prepare the instruments that apparently you're gonna have to play on the next gig. Today we're gonna talk about a couple of the most common sort of standard percussion instruments in the orchestra, and then also one kind of non-standard, non-orchestral instrument, but we'll get to that later. I'm thinking that we should start here with the snare drum, which, if anything, is kind of the baseline foundational place that anyone's going to start when they're playing or thinking about percussion. So I've got a snare drum right here. There we go. So snare drum, what we're basically looking at, let me angle this a little bit. What we're basically looking at here is I've got a drum built around cylindrical shell. In this case, it's made of brass. You get shells made out of different types of hardwoods, different metals, aluminum, brass, different carbon fibers, almost whatever you want to produce different sounds. And then I've got a drum head on the top and on the bottom of the drum. Drum heads are going to be made of either calf skin, which really is calf skin, or they're going to be made out of some kind of synthetic man-made material. This is a synthetic head. I usually use synthetic heads myself. Calf skin gets a really great sort of earthy, gutsy, unique tone, and it's what everyone had to use for all of percussion history until the last couple of decades. But when you're using real skin for your drum heads, it's very, very susceptible to changes in humidity and things. It's almost like every time you pick up the drum, you need to retune it because it sounds like a totally different drum today than it did yesterday, because today it's raining outside or today it's colder outside. And that can get a bit annoying to deal with. So these are synthetic heads. And then the thing that sets the snare drum apart are these strings across the bottom called snares. I've got, on this particular drum, we've got 3 different snares here, 1, 2, 3, or 3 different sets of snares. And what these are basically just strings of different kinds of material, different metals, different fibers that are ratcheted up against the bottom plastic head so that they can give it its specific tone. What happens is that when you hit the top head, that sound, or the head is going to vibrate. As it vibrates, it's going to push a column of air vibrating through the drum to the bottom head. The bottom head is then going to vibrate alongside the top one. And these snares that are pulled against the bottom head are going to buzz buzz and vibrate against that head to give the snare drum its specific tone. On the snare drum, we've also got this handy dandy lever right here. What this is doing, when I move it, you'll see this whole section move up and down. This allows me to pull those snares off of the bottom head, away from it, so they're not against it. So if I turn the snares off there, I've just got a drum sound, but when I pull those snares up against it, then they're going to vibrate when I hit the drum. And make that distinctive snare drum sound. Give it that raspy, choked off, militaristic kind of sound. And we usually end up playing with those snares on, but sometimes you're called to do otherwise. Historically speaking, the snare drum comes from, among other places, the Western military tradition. Just a moment here. There we go. Comes from the Western military tradition. When you picture Revolutionary War troops, Civil War troops in battle, you're picturing those little drummer boys alongside the troops, playing different cadences, different rhythms to marshal the troops to move or to stop or to say it's lunchtime or whatever. And eventually that transformed into them playing entertainment music with the fifes and the bugles, and that transitions to them playing in military bands, and yada, yada, yada. They end up playing in the orchestra over time. And by the end of the 19th century or so, snare drum is pretty standard as an instrument in the orchestra. And so I'm going to get a pair of sticks here. And so when we're thinking of that military sound, we're thinking, here, I'm going to knock the volume down a little bit so you can hear me without going deaf. We're thinking about that militaristic, rhythmic, groovy kind of sound. That kind
We heard like the first 2 notes.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Try it again. See if that'll work.
Okay, let's try this again.
And it went away.
Are we working there or no? Not working?
It works for a minute and then it goes away. What happens if you just do the regular sound?
Sure. I mean, we can try that. it's gonna clip out a little bit and be pretty loud. Let's see what
Okay,
happens.
let's just try it.
This is so unfun. I tried exactly these settings yesterday. No problems.
Oh, of course. Of course. That's how it works.
Still nothing.
Yeah. Maybe turn the gain down even more. Maybe that's the issue. Maybe it needs to be even less.
Let's try it out. Just one moment here.
By the way, as you think of questions for Keegan, please enter them into the chat, and then I will have Keegan answer them at the end of the session during our question and answer section.
I have a suspicion.
Yeah, let's try that.
Okay. Now
That worked.
On the settings that I meant to have from yesterday.
See, I can't hear you, but I can hear the drum.
Perfect. So that's what we're going to be dealing with a lot today is volume up, volume down, volume up, volume down.
Yep.
So anyway, that's our military drum kind of sound. We refer to that as rudimental drumming sometime. And that's the way the snare drum starts and develops and makes its way into the orchestra. And as it makes its way there, we develop a different kind of idea of the drum sound. So that may have sounded a bit like marching band drumming, if you're familiar with that. I'm sure we all kind of know that sound. It's not quite the right kind of drum, but it's that style of music. And as it makes its way into the orchestra and into the our standard orchestra composers, Tchaikovsky, Shostakovich, through to John Philip Sousa at times, and into the American mainstream, we develop a different kind of sound. The most basic difference between the two sounds is that our marching snare drum sound, you may have heard the rhythms in there. When I play a roll, you hear every note of the roll in like a brrrr kind of sound. But when I'm going to play in a concert style, an orchestra style sound, then I want to smooth out that roll so you don't hear the individual notes. We just get this smooth shh as much as possible anyway. And that sound will be more like this. And the way that we're accomplishing that is not a series of individual strokes, because there's no way to possibly make that happen quick enough. What we're doing is dealing with multiple different types of bounces when I'm playing. So when I'm playing that marching kind of sound, I'm getting 2 bounces each time I move a stick to the head. Versus that concert sound, I want to get 3 or more bounces. Some people think of it as a 3 bounce, some people think of it as a 5 bounce. I just think of it as more than 2 and try to smooth it out. And we get that much smoother sound.
So do you change your grip on the stick to let it bounce more?
That's exactly it. I'm mainly holding the stick right here with my front 2 or 3 fingers, and all that I'm changing is the amount of tension I'm holding it between my thumb and those fingers. If I hold it really loose, if I hold it crazy loose, then it just gets a big fat bounce. If I hold it really tight, it jams into the head. So it's just balancing exactly how tight that is, and I can change from one to the other and back. And we can hear those different kinds of sounds there. Snare drum, one of the things that I think is really fun about the snare drum is that when we all picture snare drum, and certainly when I was starting playing percussion as a kid, a lot of the times the person who starts playing drum set or percussion, and I'm no exception, is that you start playing because drums seem loud and groovy and cool and big and pizzazz. And that's what kind of draws you in from the beginning. But as you get more advanced on the drum, what you find is that the more difficult and interesting stuff is actually learning the fine motor control of very, very soft playing. I'm going to change my sticks here. Learning that fine motor control of really, really soft playing, because at a certain point, after a couple months or a couple of years, anyone can kind of play big and flashy rhythms. But the real delicate stuff is where things can get mighty interesting, is where we put a lot of our time into. When I'm thinking about that, I mean, even as simple as those rolls I was just doing, it's a lot easier for me to make a big swing than to play a really quiet roll. Let's compare these two sounds. I'll tell you what, that first one is a lot easier to do. A lot easier to do. Because the second one tiny change in one finger pressure, one slight adjustment in how high the wrist is going, and the whole sound goes out the window. It goes from a lovely zzz into a zzz, and the whole thing can fall apart. So a lot of the time when we're working on tough stuff, it's going to be soft things like that. I think about some classic moments that we like to work on. One of them is in the classic orchestra piece Scheherazade. In the third movement, there's this lovely clarinet solo. I think clarinet solo. And the snare drum just provides us what sounds like a simple little rhythmic accompaniment. The clarinet is playing this nice lilting tune. And so on. And all the snare drum is doing is one simple repeated rhythm just underneath it to give it a little bit of a drive and pulse and an interesting kind of flavor. And I think it sounds pretty straightforward if you're listening casually, but if you pay close attention, it's a monstrous tough part. In the middle of that clarinet solo, we are trying to execute the following rhythm. And that little flourish you hear at the beginning is actually 7 notes exactly equally spaced apart, just right there in that tiny amount of space. And to have those all 7 notes be exactly evenly spaced apart, none of them sticking out above the rest, it's a wild challenge. But in the texture, it's just the simple thing being a little counter melody. It's a monster of a part, much harder than almost any of the big flashy stuff that I'm going to be practicing. And yet it looks so simple. And that's sort of where a lot of the interest in the snare drum lies, I think, is the delicate, difficult, ornamented stuff way down at those expressive soft levels. And that's a lot of what I like about the instrument. But I'd say now is as good a time as any to move on to something else. So let's do that. I am going to move this.
I think you could turn your volume up just a little bit too when you're talking, just slightly. If we didn't have to worry about delay with Zoom, I'd play along with you for that.
Oh, if only. If only. Just a moment here. Okay. Here, I'm going to get extra careful about volumes because cymbals are going to be a really interesting beast. So, right here, we're looking at a pair of orchestral crash cymbals. A lot of different kinds of cymbals. These are the ones that you're most likely to see someone playing in an orchestra. And what we're looking at, it is made of bronze. It just starts as a little hunk of bronze, maybe this big, really dense and just in a ball, and it gets hammered out, flattened, lathed out until we're looking at this lovely, lovely creation here. This one has this interesting textural pattern that you'll see, And that's due to a hammering process done by a machine in the factory designed to just be sort of randomized around the instrument and give each individual cymbal a really unique tone to them. Let's see, the basic shape here is that the whole cymbal has a bit of a bowing to it with that lovely dome in the middle. We call that dome of the bell of the cymbal, and it does give a bit more of a bell kind of sound than the rest of the cymbal. Handles on it is just a simple loop made of leather that sticks through a hole in the middle, and we just have a little knot there to hold it on. And cymbals are, I think, more than most of the instruments we play are, I don't know, there's a lot of skill and a lot of technique that goes into cymbal playing, and there's also a little bit of, I don't know, alchemy and magic and dark magic to trying to get them to sound the way that we want them to sound. I've spoken with, you know, some top-level professional players about this, and even the highest level cymbal players talk about cymbals as no matter how hard you work on them and how long you work on them, 1 out of every 10 crashes is just going to sound totally different from how you thought it was about to sound. And so we work to try to get that to happen as little as possible, but it never really goes away. And so they're an interesting beast to, well, to tame and to figure out how to get them to really work the way you want them to. Even a simple crash is not so simple. I think that sometimes when people picture someone playing a pair of cymbals, they picture kind of the mechanical monkey sitting by the organ grinder and just playing them straight into each other like so. And boy do I wish it could go so simple. But when we hear a big orchestra cymbal crash, one of those big lovely crashes, what we're getting is not one single hit with them right against each other like that. What we're getting is 2 different sounds that our brains are going to interpret as one sound. What needs to happen to get that crash out is either we have one end hit and then the other end hit, or just the reverse. One end hit, the other end hit. It happens, that's what we're looking at in slow motion when we see a cymbal crash, is 2 hits there as it comes apart. And for whatever reason, our interesting, strange human brains interpret those 2 sounds as one big blooming crash. And so I'm going to knock the volume here way down, and I'm going to play a couple of cymbal crashes at different volumes, and you can see if you can see and maybe hear how it's 2 different sounds getting compressed together into one to create this sort of lush bloom that we're aiming for, or at least hopefully it sounds like that.
That's great. It happens so quickly. The 2 different touches of the cymbals, you really can't hear that it touched the cymbal twice.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting. Once you've spent enough time practicing with them, you can sort of hear the crash as 2, but the brain doesn't want to. I think for one thing, even people who have spent no time listening to orchestras have spent a good amount of time listening to orchestras just by watching movies or cartoons or anything. So we're familiar with the sound enough that we think of it as one. And so when we hear that familiar sound, it sounds like one. And for another thing, it's something about the speed and the rapidity with which it happens that it just gets logged together in our brain. Cymbals have one big thing in common with the snare drum, which is that we do spend a lot of time practicing the big loud crashes, but we spend just as much time practicing the finesse of the very, very soft, very quiet stuff. And when I play a soft cymbal crash, everyone's got a different way of doing this. I'm only showing the best way I know how to do this and the way that works for me. And boy, that could be a motto for all percussionists, that we're just trying to figure out the best thing that works for us. A lot of the time in percussion, there are no right answers because it's a pretty young art form. So for me, soft crashes, what makes it so challenging is that you need to get them absolutely close together and be able to control when they're going to hit and when they're not going to hit. I hold them right out here so I can look straight through the gap in them and make sure I'm controlling every little motion with my muscles. So I can just make the perfect hit like so.
Am I at the right volume for this right now?
Great. What this means, of course, is that actually playing soft cymbal crashes is really tiring for the arms because I'm holding them out here and just trying to do that fine motor control with two really pretty heavy implements right here. I don't know how many pounds, but whatever they think they look like they weigh a bit more than that. And you control them as just to the nth degree to make that perfect little kind of sound. I had one teacher who liked to refer to soft crash cymbal crashes as baby sneezes, because each one should just be this little we've got one excerpt from a Rachmaninoff, his second piano concerto, that's all about those soft crashes. The orchestra is playing this lush, quiet little melody, and the crashes are just giving this little bit of flavor and sort of heartbeat behind it all. And it's just about that extreme control to make every single one, if possible, just sound exactly the same as every other one. And so forth. And it's the kind of thing, as with a lot else that we do, that sounds like it shouldn't be that hard, and boy, oh boy, is it a challenge.
Control, it's the absolute control of...
And absolute control of a pretty heavy thing too, which makes it really different. If I were holding...
Yeah, I was gonna say, there are cymbals that are much bigger than what you have there.
There are, yeah. So what I'm holding right here is a pair of 18-inch diameter cymbals, so that's 18 inches across. And cymbals are going to come in any variety. You get little splash cymbals for drum sets that are only 8 inches across. You get monster 24, 26-inch cymbals that you're playing. I've played, occasionally I've used 22-inch crash cymbals that were extra thick to make really, really beastly, huge crashes, the kind that just envelop the whole orchestra. So you get a variety. These are the ones that I happen to own. These are my sort of general go-to work for everything cymbals. But no, that's a very good point. You may have also noticed while I was playing a couple times that I was pulling the cymbals against myself there. And all I'm doing there is when I want the sound of the cymbals to end, I'm going to mute them against myself so I can control what's coming out of them and when. And it helps if you're wearing a nice cushy sweater like this, of course. It gets interesting against a tuxedo in the orchestra stage. You got to make sure they're not hitting a button that's going to make a sizzling sound against them.
I didn't even think of that.
Some people, sometimes it even gets pretty silly, especially in orchestra auditions. When you're taking an audition and you're behind, when you're behind a screen, so they're only listening to the sound part of your audition. I haven't done this, but I know some players who will take those auditions in the thickest, cushiest sweatshirt that they own, so that it will almost kind of wrap up the cymbal and mute it really quick with no problem at all. It's a bit silly, but it works.
Yeah.
Which is kind of funny. It's all these little things that we end up thinking about and spending our time on. I know some players who solve another tuxedo problem when they're playing snare drum by wearing wristbands over the end of their tuxedo sleeve, because otherwise, sometimes when you're playing a roll or something tough, the end of your drumstick here will get caught in your sleeve, and it's a real problem. And in fact, sometimes I do this. Sometimes I'll wear just a pair of $5 black wristbands like you would wear for a workout right there to hold the sleeve closed so that the stick can't get caught in there. We end up making some weird solutions to weird problems. But I'd say that's enough about cymbals here. And let's move on to tambourine. Tambourine is, you won't hear it referred to very often this way, but tambourine, truth be told, is just another drum. So if I pull this out here, like the snare drum we were looking at, it's a cylindrical shell. This one is made of wood with a drum head on top of it. This one happens to have only a top head, no bottom head, and it's got these jingles around it, of course, that make that characteristic tambourine sound. If you notice on the back here, this is nothing more high-tech than electrical tape and a napkin, because that's what I'm using right now to mute the head. Sometimes when you're playing tambourine, you want to have a mixture of sound coming from the head and the jingles. Sometimes you want to really focus on the sound of the jingles. So that's why I've got that mute on there right now. Some of my tambourines, I keep that on. Some of them, I leave the head open. Different players will use different kinds of things. Some people have little gels that stick to it to mute the head. All kinds of different strategies. Some people will just stick a layer of moleskin on the back. Different things. We do a lot of low-tech stuff to make things work. Percussion is a land of duct tape and wire ties. So let's see, with the tambourine, I'm gonna knock the volume down a little bit here because this gets really surprisingly loud. And the tambourine here, I'm gonna switch to a different tambourine here. Part of the fun of the instrument is all of the different tambourines that we collect, usually because of different types of jingles on them. So this tambourine that I was just holding up, these are copper jingles, and specifically copper that's been through a special heat treating process. Here's another one of my tambourines. This one has jingles. Let's see, these ones are made of German silver, and we've got other ones on it that are made from that same silver, but silver that's gone through a special heat treating and hammering process. So we've got two different kinds of jingles on here that make a slightly different sound from each other. It's subtle, but when you combine them together, it's just another sound. I've got a couple other tambourines over there. We end up collecting these to get different kinds of sounds that are going to, this one I'm going to prefer to use for one piece because maybe it's brighter and it cuts through the orchestra. This one I'm going to use for a different piece because maybe it's got sort of a darker, crisper tone that might work for, you know, maybe some European folk musics. Different sounds for different kinds of settings. And we're going to play the tambourine, I mean, most commonly, just hitting it, pretty simple. And of course, with a combination of rolls. One of the ways that we're going to do a roll is going to be by just a simple shaking fashion to make a shake roll. And here, I'm going to, might be a bit loud, but we'll see. Nothing fancier than a simple shake. We end up spending a lot of time practicing that because it can be hard to get it to be really smooth and even through the roll. And then the other thing that we can do with the tambourine that I really love working on is what we call the thumb roll. I sometimes refer to it as the friction roll. And that is going to be a kind of, I don't know. It's interesting. Some people find it very easy. Some people find it very difficult. And it's very variant person to person. But what we're doing is, if you've ever taken a finger or your hand and run it across a surface like that, and had that sensation of your finger kind of skittering across the surface, that's what's happening with the thumb roll. And we just do that with a finger or with our thumb in very fast motion. And what it does is it vibrates the tambourine fast enough to get this very, very smooth, lush roll sound.
I find those so hard to do. I could never do those.
It can open up a whole world of opportunities. We end up taking a couple different shortcuts to get there. Some people will place some sandpaper on their tambourine to get that gritty feeling. Right here, This is a product that you can buy called a roll ring. That's basically just really, really fine sandpaper that I would just glue onto the head, and then I could just run my finger around it. And well, it's not attached, so it's not going to work. Some people use just a simple beeswax and rub beeswax on the head. And so let's see, this one has some beeswax on the head. If you see that kind of ring of texture around it, as just wax that's been rubbed on it, so that when I touch it, it's going to be a lot grittier and my finger will stick to it without much problem. So we find different solutions to that. And when we can do that and combine, use some shake rolls for some things, thumb rolls for some things, we get a lot of different sounds and opportunities, and I really like that. Let's see here. Trying to think of places to use these. The thumb roll. Trying to think of where to go with this. Another thing that we have, something interesting with the tambourine, you get a lot of different qualities of instrument, and usually when I'm playing, I'm going to be looking for the nicest possible instrument, but once in a while with percussion, you end up getting a sort of weird, cheap solution that works. So here's another tambourine right here. This tambourine cost me $8. This is an $8 instrument right here, and if I hit it forte, it's going to sound like an $8 instrument. It doesn't sound any good. But what we've found is that with these really simple, almost toy store tambourines, the soft sounds on these kinds of really cheap jingles is a really nice, crispy, soft sound. So if I'm thinking something seasonally appropriate right now, one movement from the Nutcracker, the Arabian dance, has that lovely low wind melody. And it's just that perfect little crisp sound that I can't actually get on one of these $150 tambourines. Doesn't quite work in the same way. It's a little bit mushier down in that font. Yeah. Let's see. Tambourine, I'm thinking maybe play a quick little excerpt here, and here's another moment from the Nutcracker, and probably one that you might recognize even just from hearing the tambourine part.
Did anyone recognize that? If you do, type it in the chat. I won't spoil it.
And while I was doing that, you may have seen sort of an interesting technique going on there. Something I think is super fun about the tambourine is that it's really a problem-solving instrument. I guess that's a common theme tonight, isn't it? Tambourine is interesting because it's fundamentally a one-handed instrument. I have to hold it with this hand, so I can only really play with this hand and swing it around with this hand. But what I've found, my personal view on the subject, is that most composers throughout history have written for the tambourine have forgotten that it's a one-handed instrument and write for it like it's a two-handed instrument. And even the brightest composers usually fall into the trap of forgetting that I've only got one hand to work with here. And so they write for it like it's just a different sounding snare drum or something, as if I had two hands to play it with. And what that means is that we get the fun job of figuring out how to make rhythms happen that are too hard to just play with one hand, might be too fast or too intricate, and we find our solutions to do it. So what you saw me doing there with that movement was that I'm playing with this hand, but I'm using the swinging motion of this hand to make it work a lot easier, to make myself not have to move so much with this hand and still play those quick rhythms. Another way of solving that is going to be by putting your leg up on something and just using it as like a second hand. you might just balance
Turn the volume up just a little bit.
Sometimes you might just balance it on yourself in a unique way, so that I can use both hands if I keep it propped up in such a way.
That muffles the sound a little bit though, since it's, yeah.
It does. So everything's got pros and cons. Sometimes you just put it on a well-cushioned surface. Here, I can just even use this chair right here. I might just put it on, and because the surface has a little bit of bounce to it and give. So in an orchestra, I might simulate that by just putting it on a table on a couple of towels, so that it's got a little bit of cushiness to it. If it doesn't have cushiness, then it can't go anywhere and it can't make a good sound. So that's a lot of what we spend our time on in Tambourine, is figuring out different ways to play things that composers thought were going to be easy. Which is, I don't know, you can look at that as something annoying. I look at that as a fun challenge to figure out.
Like a puzzle, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Here, I'm going to move these tambourines out of the way.
So how many tambourines do you own? Just tambourines?
I personally own 4 tambourines. Let's see here. I've got one, I bought it all the way back in high school. I've got that silly $8 one that I mentioned. I've got another one. This one is kind of an heirloom instrument right here. This is a tambourine from the early 1990s. It's been around quite a while. It was given to me as a gift by the owner of the company that makes these particular tambourines, which is Grover Pro Percussion. I used to work there, and when I left that job to go back to school, the owner gave me a gift of one of his old tambourines that he had been using in the Boston Pops for about 20 years. So this is my like lovely, glorious heirloom tambourine right here. It's got a really nice sound. These are nice, bright bronze jingles. It's got a real pow kind of factor. If I play it loud, it's going to cut through anything I need it to. So yeah, I've got 4 tambourines, but I'm sure sometime soon I'll own more. And that's just the way of the percussionist. Here, let's see. Running out of time a little bit more than I anticipated, so I'm going to do maybe a quick little bit about triangles and then move on.
That works.
Sure. So
the triangle is more complicated than it looks.
The triangle is absolutely more complicated than it looks. More complicated than anyone expects it to be. I think that, I mean, what you alluded to there is something true, that often triangle is the butt of a joke when someone needs to make a musical joke. And triangle is the instrument that we give to someone who doesn't know how to play so they can jam with the people who do know how to play. But the truth is that the triangle is a really tricky, complicated thing in certain ways. In certain ways, it's a really simple thing. What's nice about this instrument is it's just one thing. It's not a bunch of pieces assembled to make a complicated instrument. This really is just one piece of metal bent into a triangle. This one is made of steel. I've got a couple here that are made of bronze. But it is just one piece of metal, and that's nice. We hang it on a clip. I've got, let's see. It's hanging from a couple pieces of fishing line there. The goal is just to get the thinnest string possible so that we don't have string dampening the sound of the instrument while we're playing. And the triangle, what makes it really cool is that triangles really are snowflakes. Every triangle is completely different from the next triangle. Every spot on the triangle is different from any other spot on that same triangle. And what I mean is just that no matter what you do with this instrument, where I hit it, what angle I hit it at, what speed I hit it at, I'm going to get a totally different sound from the same instrument here. And once you open up your world into having a couple different triangles, then you've just got seemingly millions of sounds to choose from. The fun of it is being able to make a ton of different sounds with it. The challenge of it is when I want to make the same sound twice in a row. It can be quite a challenge. And I'll play some of that for you in a moment, but before that, I want to maybe give you kind of a framework for listening. When I'm listening to triangle, I'm listening to them usually on a spectrum from what I'm thinking of as a pure tone to a complex tone. And when I'm thinking of a pure tone, what I mean is it sounds almost like a clear pitch, like a bell. That might sound kind of like this. You can hear a pretty clear pitch. It's almost like dinging a desk bell or something. And I'm going to contrast that with when I play other triangles, or when I play that triangle in a different way. Here, I'll use the same triangle, but I want to get a more complicated, complex tone. I'm looking for something that's stacking a bunch of pitches on top of each other, some low sounds, some middle sounds, some high sounds. So the sound that comes out is sort of rough and crunchy and sparkles and shimmers in a certain way. And I can do that on the same triangle just by hitting in a different place, at a different angle with a different technique to it. Compared to that first sound. Totally different here. Some other things that you can do to find different sounds. So here's a couple triangles made of bronze. And on this one, if you noticed, the texture of the triangle is totally smooth, simple metal. This one is kind of like the cymbals that we looked at earlier. It's got this hammering pattern all over it. It's been through a really rough hammering process to give it a unique tone. When you do that, that makes the metal go from this pure, simple, concentrated sound, and it washes out into this broad spectrum of tones. So that's going to be very different from the first one. I'm not sure if it's going to sound that different from the first one in the microphone here. I hope it does.
What's interesting, I don't know if everyone else can hear this. I can really hear the overtones. I mean, like I can hear multiple pitches, and every time you strike it someplace different, I hear a new pitch. It's kind of interesting how the speakers are picking it up.
I'm so glad, and that's exactly what it sounds like here. Every time I hit a triangle, it sounds a little different, and that's the beauty of it. Honestly, I can spend hours just going through my triangle collection, trying to look for slightly different sounds, figure out playing which part of which triangle with which beater is going to work for which piece. And if I angle the camera here a little bit, here's just 3 triangles of mine, but I've also got this big collection of different triangle beaters that I can use. I was just using a pretty small beater. I might use a larger beater for playing something really loud to cut through the orchestra. These ones are made of brass, a couple are made of aluminum. Here is a special beater. If you can see, it's got that lovely teardrop shape to it. And what that does is that the goal is that I can play sort of anything with this one beater. I can play really soft stuff with the smaller tip of the beater. And if I want to play a big, loud roll, I can use that thicker barrel part of the beater so that I can change volumes pretty quickly using the same implement. So I'm thinking I'll just take, 30 seconds here, hit some different triangles in different places, and see if everyone can hear the really different tones that we can get out of them.
Okay.
And you might have seen there, like I was doing with the cymbals, pulling them up against me to mute them, I'm doing the same thing here. I'm using my fingers when I want to stop the sound. And using that, we can even make some pretty cool groove patterns. And so you find that in a lot of different musics from Latin America. You find that as kind of a groove drummy kind of instrument. Especially Brazil. Brazil uses a lot of groove triangle. But that's the triangle. I could talk a bunch about the marimba, but do you think, Sammy, that maybe I should just go right into playing a solo and then take some questions?
I think that works. Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to shift over here to this lovely large instrument you see to my, whatever this side is for you. This is a marimba. Quick introduction. If it looks like a big xylophone, that's because it's more or less a big xylophone. There are some technical nitty-gritty differences, but we don't need to get into those kinds of sonic details here. What we're looking at is some large keys made of Honduran rosewood suspended over aluminum tubes or resonators. Each of these the instrument is tuned just like a piano keyboard. And for each bar, the bar is tuned to a certain pitch. This here is a B flat. And then the tube beneath it is also tuned to a B flat. So when I play this bar, sound vibrates, goes into the resonator beneath it. The resonator also vibrates that same pitch and amplifies it out. So it's a percussion instrument and it's kind of a wind instrument at the same time. And that's how we get a really cool mellow sound out of it.
I might turn the volume up just slightly. Let's see
Sure.
if, because the marimba's not going to be crazy loud.
I think high gain is going to be fine for this.
Yeah.
So right here, the marimba is one of our best solo instruments and kind of our go-to solo instrument. So I'm going to play a piece over here by a composer from the Buffalo area named Robert Zolnowski. This piece is called Awfu. It is based on a couple of different things. It's based on some of the traditional marimba music played on one of the marimba's predecessors, which is the Jil, a West African instrument from the Degara region of Ghana. So this solo takes some ideas from Jil music, mixes it up with some contemporary American rhythms and some sort of marching band sound ideas into this sort of groovy, hypnotic, fun tune. And I hope you like it. It's really fun, don't you think?
Yeah, lots of polyrhythms in there and all sorts of stuff. Very cool.
Very, very polyrhythmic, but I think polyrhythmic in the way that never makes you feel lost.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I hope it is.
We had one viewer commented that they couldn't hear the bottom note in your far left hand, but I wonder if that's because your right hand was the melody. So you were balancing your right hand to come out a little bit more. Pianists do this too, where they play their left hand a little bit softer so that the melody really comes out in the right hand.
Yeah.
So that may have been what you were hearing. So, well, all right. If you guys think of questions as we're walking through the list of questions, please feel free to type them in the chat and we'll make sure that Keegan gets to them. So I'm going to scroll back up here to the top. Betsy Frank, who's a longtime supporter of the Terre Haute Symphony, asks, how many instruments do you own?
Oh boy. Ooh, what a question. You know, what's interesting is that I have to ask, how do you define instrument? Because truly I do. When we're talking about major instruments like the marimba or like a snare drum or a pair of cymbals, not that many. I've got 5 or 10 things of that size. I've got probably a couple dozen smaller little things like tambourines and triangles. I've got maybe 10 triangles. I've got 4 tambourines. I've got, castanets, a pile of wood blocks, all kinds of things like that. But then you get into the weird stuff. Then you get my pile of kazoos that's sitting over there and my pile of whistles. You get into my pile of whirly tubes, which are those silly little tubes that you buy at the dollar store like a pool toy, and you swing it around and it makes those pitches. And then you get into, and because I have been asked to play these things in concerts, you get to the pile of rocks that I have that make a really good sound when you hit them together or when you scrape them together. You get to the old crunchy leaves that I've gathered so I can make crunchy leaf sounds. We end up doing weird things. And so my pile of sort of random stuff is, maybe a couple of 100 things large. And then I've also got a couple dozen, maybe 50 serious considered pieces of percussion instruments.
Yeah. I have to say, I had to purchase a police whistle. I played a piece with the Indianapolis Chamber Orchestra, and in the second clarinet part, there was a police whistle cue. And so I went on Amazon and I bought my $5 police whistle. So I have a police whistle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I've had to go to the dollar store before to gather crystal glasses so you can rub the rim of the crystal glass to make pitches, and I've got a couple that are marked with Sharpie how high to fill the water to make different pitches. Sometimes you end up going to Home Depot and testing out the pitches of the flower pots there to see if any of them will be the right note that you need. These are all things that we have to do with a straight face.
Yes. Okay, next question. Do different drumsticks make a big difference? So the types of wood, the thickness, the size?
Yes. I would say that they make a small difference in the sound and a big difference in the feel. So often which stick I'm using on specifically snare drum is going to be more about what it feels like to me playing than what it sounds like to the audience. We have here, I'm going to get a couple different ones. So here's a couple of pretty different pairs of snare drum sticks. Here, I'll just hold up one from each pair. And so if you look at them, they've got some very different shapes to the ends of the sticks.
Yeah. Okay.
And we get very different weights. So this is made from a very lightweight wood. I think this is maple, and that the end of it has a very interesting shape to make a very small bead at the front and a very small sort of end of the stick. So this I can use for really soft, delicate stuff, and because it's light, that makes it easier, and the weight at the front is designed to make that easier. This stick is a very special, unique shape. It's kind of a middle weight of wood, but because of that weird barrel shape at the end, it has a very special active bounce to it. So I use this when I need to play something where I'm going to get a lot of bounce off the drum. And this is a more sort of traditional snare drum shaped stick. And even, you may not be able to tell, but it's a very thick stick, and you can't see this, but it's really heavy. So I'm going to use this for loud things just because it's a bit heavier and thicker and can get a real bigger punch on the drum. So it's more about feel, but it does affect the sound a bit. And it affects my abilities a bit, which then affects the sound.
You just blame it on the stick clarinetist, blame it on our reeds all the time.
Right?
Totally okay. Okay, you can kind of give us an overview because you own so many instruments, but how much do these instruments cost?
Oh, sure. I own instruments that I've purchased at the dollar store. I've got some medium things. The snare drum I was playing was about a $650 instrument. That pair of cymbals is, I think, like an $800 pair of cymbals, but I got them on a sweet discount for like $550. At the way top end, this marimba is, if it were new, I think it's about a $14,000 instrument. I purchased this one used from a friend for more like $9,000. So, but again, I've purchased lots of instruments that I have really used for real paid performances at the dollar store, like those little tubes or a wine glass or a flower pot. So you get everything in between. Some things are more expensive than you expect. This triangle is like a $180 triangle. You might not expect that. Most of the tambourines we were looking at were like $150 to $200 instruments. But then you get things that really aren't that bad. A great wood block is $20. So it very varied, and that's part of it. Nothing, we don't have anything like some, woodwind or brass players do. And, I hear about contrabassoons that cost $60,000. We don't have anything like that. We have a lot of medium expensive things and a couple of pretty expensive things. But
what about timpani? Is that kind of the exception a little bit?
Timpani is kind of the exception. There are good professional timpani that are $20,000 for the set. There are truly great professional timpani that are $50,000, $60,000 for the set.
Okay,
but,
and that's typically when the orchestra owns that, not the player.
Exactly. Usually the orchestra is going to be the one who's buying that, and maybe they're going to do it. Often they do it off of a grant that's specifically they plan. We want to buy a set of timpani. Let's do a grant for this.
Yes. Yep. Okay. How do the dimples on the cymbals affect the sound?
Ooh, sure. Okay. Picture a large metal dinner tray or baking sheet, or just a large plate. Maybe just some sort of large glass plate that you have. If you sort of strike the edge of that, it might produce kind of a straightforward, like ooh kind of a sound. Excuse me. And it's going to get a kind of a pure sound. Just like when I was talking about triangle, the sound without that many overtones where you get a clear pitch out of it. The dimples, which are created by that hammering process, which is more or less what it sounds like. It's a machine that's striking it with metal many hundreds of times. We get those dimples, and that, because the object is no longer sort of a pure geometric piece of material, it no longer creates that pure tone. As the sound waves go through all the strange curves of the metal, the sound waves get all warped and you get a lot of different pitches out of it. So instead of sounding like a dinner plate, it sounds like a complicated wash of sounds.
Right, a ton of overtones. Yeah, exactly. Okay.
And I'll tell you, sometimes I know some people who, when they have a pair of cymbals that they want to sound a little bit more complicated, will go to pretty crazy lengths to make that happen. People don't want to hammer their own cymbals because they're afraid of breaking them. But I know one professional player from a major US symphony that whenever he buys cymbals, he hangs them from a tree in his backyard and lets the weather do what it will to them for a couple weeks or a couple of months. And then at the end, he swears that they sound a lot better because they've aged and they've gone through like a serious physical process. I know another serious professional cymbal player who, whenever he buys a set of cymbals, he will bury them in his backyard for 6 months. And when they come out, they sound like they've been dimpled and like they've been aged 50 years into a set of like classic old cymbals.
Wow.
So we get
holy cow.
I've got friends who do something similar with triangles. I showed you the triangle that doesn't have any dimpling and a triangle that does have the hammering. And sometimes people who have a couple triangles like this, but they want one of them to sound more complicated. And don't try this at home, kids, but I've got friends who I've watched throw their triangle off of the roof of a building onto a parking lot to just scratch it up, ding it up, give it those dents to get a more complicated sound. If you're unlucky, it breaks, and if you're lucky, it ends up sounding amazing.
What a risk.
Yeah, right? But I genuinely have good friends who I've watched do that in person, and it's worked great.
Oh. Do you protect your ears, or is there any way percussionists protect their ears against the loud noises?
I do protect my ears. I did not have my earplugs in for this because I knew I was only going to be playing the loud things for extremely short amounts of time. But in rehearsals, I will usually be wearing earplugs. In concerts, I will sometimes be wearing earplugs depending on what I'm playing. When I'm practicing, I will essentially always be playing earplugs. Even something that's not that loud, like a marimba, is medium loud, and you're practicing for long enough that sound is going to be kind of a problem. And so I wear earplugs in my ears most of the time when I'm playing, and I'm very, very careful about that. Back when I was in high school, I did not know any better, and when someone told me to put in my earplugs, I usually wouldn't listen. And so back in high school, I did some minor damage to my hearing, and I will always have a little bit of damage to my hearing because that really doesn't come back. But because I sort of discovered that around the beginning of college, I discovered that I had that little bit of hearing loss from marching band. I immediately took quick action. Every single day, you know, when people think about when they leave the house, you always have phone, wallet, keys, right? I always have phone, wallet, keys, earplugs, always. Even if I'm not going out to play music, because you never know when you're going to have to walk past a construction site for a couple of minutes. Mm-hmm. If you're in a city and you got to take the subway, that's going to destroy your ears, even just a couple trips. You never know when you're going to need earplugs when you leave the house. So I've always got them.
That's great. That also brings up kind of an interesting point. For those of you familiar with how the Terre Haute Symphony sets up, the clarinets typically sit right in front of the percussion section. And so we get a lot of sound back from behind us. And in some orchestras that I've played with, we've been lucky to have sound shields behind us so that the sound of the percussion, particularly loud snare drum, loud bass drum, even loud timpani, the way that it's angled, because we're a little bit below, it's right at our ear level. We have to be careful, and it's hard for wind players to wear earplugs because we're creating a tight suction with our mouthpiece. And if I put earplugs in, I feel like I'm playing in a bubble. Like I can't hear how I sound. So there's a lot that we try to do with sound shields to protect the winds that sit right in front of the percussion from also hearing loss as well.
It's very important. I always wish I didn't have to be right behind wind players. And whenever Sammy, I realize I'm setting up a cymbal right behind your head, at the very least, I make sure that before rehearsal, I sort of say, hey,
yes,
just so you know, this is going to be a situation today.
And there have been times where I will prepare and I will put my fingers in my ears because I know that that's coming up and I know that I'm not playing.
And I will never, ever be offended by someone near me while I'm playing, putting their fingers in their ears. Never, ever.
All right. Do your neighbors ever complain about your practicing?
It's a great question. I'll tell you, for the louder things here, cymbals, snare drum, tambourine, I have a separate practice space that I usually use for those. Sometimes I used to live in a place that had a basement. That helped a great deal. Now I've just got a different practice space that I use for those separately that's not up against neighboring walls. I do, where I am here, have neighbors up against that wall and that wall. But because they're just hearing marimba and it's kind of mellow and it sounds kind of nice, usually I don't get complaints. I also tend to do that thing that I think a lot of musicians do, which is that when I move into a new place, before I start making a racket, I say hi to the neighbors. I say, hi, I'm a musician. If there's ever a problem, here's my phone number. Anytime there's a problem, you just let me know and I'll stop. I'm not going to practice after such and such an hour or before such and such an hour. And I'm sure we can make this work. And you know what if that neighbor is ever having a loud dinner party, or if they're ever doing something noisy, I'll tell you, I'm never going to complain. So I think it probably works out both ways.
Yeah. How do you decide what size of a snare drum you play? Some are higher than the one you showed. So Betsy, you asked this one. By higher, do you mean like the rim of the drum is higher, or the actual height of the drum?
Or the pitch.
Or the pitch?
No, the height of the drum. I mean, like you see a snare drum that's not as skinny this way, it's taller.
Ah, yes.
Sure. Yeah, so there are a lot of types of snare drums. What I'm using here is a relatively small concert snare drum. Here, let me go get it. What I'm using here is a relatively small concert snare drum, so it's not that broad. It's this one specifically is 5 inches. This is a 5-inch snare drum. Sometimes we use a 6.5-inch for sort of louder music. For one thing, it most directly affects the volume. As simple as it is, a bigger drum is louder, a smaller drum is softer. Sometimes if we're playing really, really soft stuff, we'll use what we call a pancake drum, which is just 2 or 3 inches wide. But of course, sometimes if you see a marching band, often their drums are going to be like 10, 12, 14 inches wide. If you ever go see like an old school fife and drum, like the old military rope drum slung around someone, that's going to be 18, 20 inches deep, or even more so. So it's just about different styles, you get different sounds. The bigger it is, usually that means the lower it is and the louder it is. Or if it's the smaller it is, higher in pitch and at least a bit softer.
Yeah.
Not that any of them are truly soft.
Does the conductor tell you what kind of triangle or tambourine to use?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Sometimes
David is particular sometimes, but not always.
David can be particular sometimes, but I think something that I like about the way David runs a rehearsal and runs an orchestra is that usually he doesn't come at it from the angle of, I want you to use this certain triangle or this certain tambourine or this certain stick or mallet. He comes at it from, I am hoping that you can make this sort of sound. And he knows that we, the percussionists, have spent more time getting to know the percussion instruments that we've got. So I'm going to know what kind of instrument I have that can make the kind of sound that he is describing and hoping for. And I think that's a really healthy relationship between conductor and percussionist is,
yeah.
Conductor says, how can you make this sound? That I know I want this sound, and I can say, let me work with what I have to get as close to your idea as I can.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Okay, this one comes from Sherry Daly. She's on our board. Is the timpanist considered a different breed of percussionist?
I think that is about the best way I've ever heard it described.
I think that's a great way to put it.
That's exactly it. Because they are a percussionist, but they're not in the percussion section.
Right.
But they are in the percussion section, but they're not.
Right. Because we have a principal percussion, which is you, and then a principal timpanist.
Yes, exactly. And so that the timpanist, they are a percussionist. You'll never meet a timpanist who's bad at percussion. You'll never meet a serious percussionist who's bad at timpani. But some timpanists really focus on timpani, and they don't have the kind of long-honed skills on percussion that a percussionist might. Some percussionists really focus across percussion and less timpani, and they don't have as much skill over in timpani land as they might wish they did. So it's complicated. Timpanists are percussionists, but they're not in the percussion section, but they are in the percussion family. It's a strange relationship. They're a different breed.
It's similar in the clarinets, actually, because bass clarinet is such a specialized instrument. A lot of people focus primarily on bass clarinet. It's not that they can't play B flat. It's a little bit different skill set. And you'll have people that will go audition just for bass clarinet positions and not B flat positions. So, but they're still in the clarinet section. So yeah, it's very similar. Mm-hmm. How often do you have to move your marimba, and how difficult is it to use? For example, when we did Music in Bloom at Central Presbyterian in May.
I move it as little as possible. This year,
he probably hated me when I asked him, "Can you bring your own marimba?"
I wouldn't say that. Move it as little as possible. It's not. I'll tell you for one thing that the specific model of marimba that I purchased, one of the many reasons that this is the marimba that I own is because it's one of the models that's the easiest to move around. For example, the resonators, the tubes underneath it, those come off in 3 sections: the high notes, the middle notes, and the low notes, so that one person can take them off. Whereas if they were all stuck together, it would definitely require 2 people to pick it up off the instrument. So it's not great to do this with one person, but technically I could put that together on my own, even though in total it weighs, God, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of pounds.
When you brought it into Central, you had 4 or 5 different bags, and you take the keys off because they all stay connected with the rope, and you roll them up. So it's like a roll of keys. And then, like you said, the frame just comes apart and you can fold it together. When I was in high school, I played marimba and had to move a marimba a couple times in marching band.
Yep.
So it, like you said, it is nice to have 2 people, but it'd be,
Yep. None of it is intentionally, none of it is screwed or bolted together. It comes off in discrete parts, about, let me see, something like 15 or 20 discrete parts that are really just sitting in specially built slots so that it just kind of sits together, but is not affixed for the most part.
Yeah. How many percussionists are there generally for a single symphonic performance? It's a good question.
Sure. So most orchestras, when they can, will usually employ a timpanist and 3 or 4 percussionists, a principal and 2 or 3 others. That's because that's going to be sort of the most common upper number that you'll need. Some concerts will just need 1 or 2 percussionists. A lot will need 3 or 4, and a few concerts will need 5 or 6, or if you're doing something really unique, some unique project, more than that. Of course, there's also a lot of concerts where we don't need any percussionists. Maybe it's a string orchestra only concert. Maybe it's a concert where all of the music was written before 1820 or so, which usually means that there's timpani but no percussion, usually. So there's shows where none of the percussionists get called. There's a lot where it's 3 or 4. And let me see, at least once I've been on a program that needed 18 percussionists, but not with the Terre Haute Symphony.
Well, and talk a little bit about your role as principal percussionist. When we get a concert and you get the music, it's your job to kind of assign, right? The different parts to your section.
Exactly. Percussion has a lot of really specific needs. So rather than the music director or anyone else deciding which percussionist will play which instrument on which tune, all the parts go to me, and one of my jobs as the principal player is to divide those up and make the plans for all of that. And we decide who plays what based on a lot of things. I try to run my percussion section as a benevolent democracy if I can. Basically, I get to choose who plays what, which means that if I want to be selfish, I can just take all of the cool parts and give everyone the boring parts, if you will. But the truth is, one boring part to me is not a boring part to someone else, and vice versa, and it varies. Sometimes there's a concert where I say, I really want to work on playing snare drum this time around, and so I'll take a lot of snare drum parts. Sometimes there's a concert where I think I want to really move around the section and play different stuff, so I'll do that. And usually once I've decided what I want to play, I use a combination of logic based around what part might be suited to another player, and usually I talk to the other players and I say, hey, on this piece, what do you want to play? This is a cool part. This is also a cool part. Which one sounds cooler to you? And I like to run it that way because, of course, in a section as good as we always have in Terre Haute, I'm not worried about someone being able to pull something off. I know everyone's going to sound great on everything. So I say, hey, do you want to play cymbals or bass drum this time around?
Yeah. Well, and there's a sense of logistics too. You know, if someone's on the far side of the stage, you got to make sure they're not playing something 2 bars later on the next side. So depending on how the section is set up, there's also a lot of logistics that you have to consider when assigning parts as well. So I think that answers our last question, which was, is there a pecking order in the symphony, or, you know, who's on top, who's on bottom? How do you assign those parts? So
Sure.
Thanks for giving us a little insight to that. Well, we are way over time. This was super interesting. I learned so much about percussion that I did not know. Thank you, everybody, for being able to join us.